Hello again, and welcome to what will be the final edition of the Grain Play Seminar Series. This is Isaac Johnson again, and today I want to take some time to reflect on the seminar series as a whole and my experience with doing this series. I think it began with me challenging some of my own notions and perceptions on organic agriculture and really looking through the published literature to understand what really are the benefits, what are the challenges of organic, and what is the path forward. In the previous episode of the seminar series, I was able to take some time to sit down and talk with some college students about their questions or comments on the series as a whole. And I think getting those outside perspectives was really useful for furthering this series. And as such, for this final episode, I was able to get a chance to interview a few members of the Grand Place Foundation board. And I think sharing their unique journeys through the world of agriculture and organic agriculture, and also how they became involved with the Grain Place, is really useful for understanding this whole topic from a different perspective and gaining their insights and just hearing their stories. So, without further ado, I want to give our first guest of the final episode, Chuck Porter, a chance to introduce himself and tell us a bit about his story and how he became involved in agriculture and eventually with the Grain Place Foundation.
Yeah, so I'm Chuck Porter. I live in southeast Nebraska. My closest town and mailing address is Unadilla, Nebraska. Uh, Raised my family here, my wife and two kids, a son and a daughter. Tied pretty closely to Syracuse, the largest town closest to us, where our kids went to school. Um Both Susanna, my wife, and I grew up in central Indiana, and met in college. And I went to seminary immediately following college, uh, United Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. And while there, really started feeling like I was answering a kind of a call towards some sort of ministry involved with um, care for the land, stewardship of natural resources. But there wasn't much clarity with that initially. But I attended a lecture series by Wes Jackson, founders of the Land Institute, and what he had to say over a couple of days, several lectures, really resonated with me on, the degree to which we tend to ignore consequences for our actions, especially uh, in terms of management of natural resources. Um, and uh, I went ahead. I got my master's degree from that seminary, but at the same time, really trying to make some sense of what kind of life in ministry can you have, you know, for what loosely could be called environmental ministry. Um, I was fortunate that it is through that connection and that uh, schooling that I became familiar with the Vetter family, because Dave Vetter is a graduate of that same seminary. Many years before I was there, but he was an advisory board member to United Seminary's Environmental Ministries project that I became the student director of for about a year and a half. So I was able to become familiar with David and to start, uncovering what the Grain Place was and who this family was, especially this father and son, Don and Dave, who um, had realized things needed to be done differently in agriculture. Um, Not that they hadn't dabbled in what we would call conventional ag. I mean, Don Vetter had stories to tell about, following the prescriptions of plenty of conventional ag practitioners and, getting on the bandwagon himself. Um, but then almost just as fast realizing it was uh, taking their farm down a path that was unhealthy, that was ecologically unsound, and he realized something different needed to happen out there. So, kind of all over the place here, but I mean, to know that story from the Vetter family because of those connections uh, helped me a ton, in being able to try to sort out, what life should be about for me, vocationally, spiritually, and uh, we became familiar or acquainted with a landowner here near where we live now, a man who had retired back to this area from a life as a physicist, a professional life, came back and had inherited half of his family farm here near Unadilla, and he really felt called to turning that farm back around to a diversified um, operation, with cattle and good crop rotations and a focus on soil health, with an eye towards trying to, as much as possible, manage a self-contained organism, if you will, of a farm. And I don't know, myself being the dreamer and the you know the person who, and I can say this about myself, tends to act on pie in the sky dreams more quickly than really working through plans and working through the realities that are. We moved with our young family, our two little kids in tow, uh, one 3 and one, not even quite a year old, onto a farm here in southeast Nebraska to begin a journey of working with a landowner to, like I said, try to develop a plan for the place. Um, Dabbled a little bit in trying to establish a grass-based dairy herd on the farm. I did establish a business growing organic produce for direct sale, um, farmers market customers, but also had some luck with clients that were caterers and restaurateurs, and but ultimately learned the hard way that I just, it wasn't going to sustain itself, and we didn't have much security really as a young family. So uh, stuck it out in that situation. Did an immense amount of improvements to that farm, and I think paved the way for some other folks to move on to the farm later and give it their own go. But we moved off that farm now nearly 17 years ago, and have lived on an old farmstead acreage here in Odo County. And somewhere in the thick of that whole process, I was fortunate to be able to get a job, first off with as a contract worker with NRCS, but ultimately hired on full time as a federal employee with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I've had a lot of different responsibilities and roles, but I serve as a civil engineering technician, working to evaluate soil erosion concerns in land across the southeastern uh, the extreme southeastern 5 counties of the state. Um, it's important that in that work we are working with volunteer landowners to come to the table with us and agree that there's some problems to be dealt with, some concerns in terms of soil erosion and water quality and air quality and soil health concerns that um, necessitate having a good relationship with one another. Let's look at these problems. Let's evaluate how to move forward. Still with a productive farm, still with some profitability, some security, but not so much with the mindset of just you know running roughshod over everything just to produce um, ingredients for the conventional ag systems. So um, so that's meant that kind of work is all about building relationships. It's all about trust. It's all about being able to talk truths and talk um, hardball about consequences. And um, I think that's an important discussion that we all need to be having in many avenues of life. But I mean, in agriculture now we're still beholden to a system that tries to ignore its consequences, or tries to overcome the consequences with um, an arsenal of well, you've seen the imagery. It's like we're supposed to believe it's all it's warfare. It's an arsenal of weaponry against nature in order to control um, those consequences, and all the while realizing over and over and over again we're just making either more consequences for ourselves or making the current consequences more severe. Um, and and it's not that organic agriculture is divorced from that. I mean, you can go across the whole continent and see plenty of bad examples of organic agriculture. They meet they meet the bare minimum of requirements of the knots, right? Don't
Hmm.
do this, don't do that, and don't do that, but aren't mindful of the farm as an ecosystem or as an organism. And uh, again, those sorts of consequences beget one another. Um, what's different with some farms, including the grain place, is that there is a mindfulness. That to me, that's one key word that I always settle on thinking about the grain place is grain place isn't without its struggles. It isn't without its own problems. Because grain place, as much as any farm, still trying to force land to do what we want it to do. To produce food and feed. But there's a mindfulness to it. There's an effort to learn from those consequences on any given year or over any given 10 years, of what have I been paying attention to on this farm that is meaningful in terms of um, how the farm can be that organism, like I was talking about. And driving down the highway past most farms, it's hard to see any differences between farm after farm after farm. But you drive up Highway 14 in Hamilton County, Nebraska, and you take note. You take note immediately that this is a different place, that this is a place that has a boundary of trees around it for a good reason, and if you take the time to pull onto the place, you recognize the place is teeming with birds and with songbirds and other wildlife. And that immediately says something about the care that's involved in honoring um, that circle of life that we're all really a part of. And I don't know, it would kind of seem to be in a situation right now, certainly nationally, but probably globally, where there's a disdain for such talk. There's a disdain for that mindfulness, because somehow we're smarter than our consequences, right? We're going to figure out the next fix to the consequence, um, and hit it head on, and well, then it's gone. And that practically never proves true in conventional agriculture. We're just always trying to get on top of the latest problem that we're causing for ourselves. And you know, we do have the resources and we do have the practitioners to fall back on to learn how to do this a better way and to still focus on productivity, still focus on profitability, um, focus on food systems that uh, make sense for a populace of people that needs to eat, not just make sense for the commodity markets, or to the industrial, blenders of ingredients, right?
So, from this portion of my discussion with Chuck, it is clear that he has a unique journey through the world of agriculture and into the world of organic and eventually into his current position with the Grain Place and NRCS. And I think his journey through seminary really contributes to this discussion of mindfulness and his approach to agriculture and seeing the interconnectedness of things. I think this is definitely something that's missing in the world of agriculture as a whole from some practitioners, as he discussed and we've discussed in the series. People are able to go through and just simply check the boxes to meet the standards of organic without truly exemplifying this mindfulness that is present in some operations, some organic operations, but is not there in others. And with that in mind, our conversation took a turn here. I wanted to bring up the idea of moving beyond organic, as was a theme throughout this series as a whole. And I wanted to ask Chuck about his thoughts on things like the regenerative movement and moving beyond organic.
I think the path forward for organic is to recognize that we're always in trouble with our buzzwords, right? We're always going to be, so there's some folks in the organic sector that feel threatened by talk of regenerative ag and vice versa, right? But in a room full of people, if we did an exercise and people were to write down the five important things about regenerative ag or of organic ag, you know, people are going to be all sorts of places with how they're defining things. Um, I think intentionally the word regenerative was really supposed to be about, again, seeing the world around us for all of these ecologies that exist separately, but also are part of this greater whole of life and of ecosystems and of just frankly even just the mystery that is. Um, but we all get a hold of concepts and we start to try to mold them and define them, so that we can spread the energy about it. And I think regenerative. We're going to be in a situation, or we already are in a situation where we're pitting people against one another in a way, for from different mindsets, different conceptual angles, toward how to manage our resources. And I think what's more important is that development of those relationships on local, regional, national, and beyond levels that allow for those conversations to take place. And, like I know for myself, I need to be much, much better at listening to my neighbors who I don't want to say, well, I'm surrounded by conventional ag, right? Well, I'm also surrounded by really awesome neighbors, who would do anything for you. And that's important. That's an important thing to keep in mind, that these are human beings who are good people, um, and deserve to be listened to. And you want to feel like reciprocally, you know, you deserve the same. And to be able, to do that on these little pockets of individual relationships and, unabashedly talk about life and talk about the consequences I was mentioning earlier, and how to do that and let your guard down and move forward towards a healthier, you know, future. Um, is it important for me to convince? I mean, even as I'm talking, I hear the spray rig across the road. You know, I would never run out there and stand in front of him and prevent him from doing what in his current mode of operation is absolutely necessary today, or he's going to have some failures on his hand, right? At the same time, um, you know, I'm mindful of how much that conversation needs to happen more casually about, there are serious consequences, and we do need people, not only to be mindful of that, but to support the measurement of that, to support people who are looking into the consequences. What are our consequences in terms of soil health on farms, in terms of how much soil erosion is still taking place on farms, and it really is at an alarming rate still, how much, how many billions of tons of topsoil worldwide are lost. What is the water quality? What is the air quality measures in regions? Because that work really doesn't take place to a good enough extent. Also, the consequences of the chemistries that are used on our ag lands. We readily accept the use as directed, instructions on a lot of chemical formulations with zero understanding of what the chemical and biological consequences are ultimately, right?
Hmm.
Um, and that those chemical processes are happening all over the place all the time now, that once these compounds you know uh, achieve the intended result, uh, they still have to break down. And the assumption for a lot of these is that they break down into either harmless or harmless enough, you know compounds that there's nothing to worry about. But there's been enough funding in recent years to delve into it somewhat, to start recognizing, wow, there really are some nasty things that form, uh, you know, in the soil after chemicals break down and make new bonds, with other chemical molecules. So, um, anyway, it's not necessarily helpful to go down that route, but I think, it's good to have those conversations and to be able to be mindful that, um, we're not really enemies of one another. We're all really, trying to make it through this same, this same life at the same time. And we you may have even watched it. The first webinar we did through the Grain Place was a webinar that David Meyer, Chuck Francis, and I put on, and there were a few people who told me they were surprised we did it, because it wasn't all about everybody and everything should be converting to organic agriculture immediately. It was about, hey, there is an amazingly organized food system in this world that floors you, to know, I can drive to the store if I've got a hankering for any product that I can think of, you know, within reason, right? I'll be able to find it. And that's because there's all of these different uh, legs of that production and supply chain that make that happen. Um, Again, that's full of immense amount of consequences, but it's also such a beautiful thing. And to be able to harness um, that existing, infrastructure, and begin tweaking it towards a healthier agriculture, an agriculture that focuses on understanding its consequences and understanding its important part to play in a local ecosystem. And and to be in a sense proud of that at the same time. Let's form communities around that, and let's not be um, bashful is not the right word, but let's not be embarrassed that the conversation needs to take place. Um, that again for me is a thing that stands out boldly about the grain place is that it's boy right there it is. It's right there in a sea of corn and soybean growers, um, with spray planes banking around that farm all the time, and the work has continued, and it's continued for years and years and years to the point where, um, with a straight face, David Vetter can talk about a 9-year rotation to somebody, and it's somebody who's interested in it, right? And that's saying a ton when you're that far into, two rotations. I mean, when you hit 18 years and then you hit 27, like wow, this is going somewhere with tweaks along the way, right? But with the idea of, yeah, we got to figure this out. How can we close these loops? How can we have far less or maybe even no outside inputs brought into a farm, and and have a farm that's resilient and provides for a, a farm family or a farm corporation that is also resilient. They don't bemoan the consequences of the when it won't stop raining, or when it's drought conditions. In the moment, those are major concerns, but over the long haul, and I'm talking over the long haul of years, you recognize the importance of focusing on the farm as a healthy ecosystem and not just a substrate for growing truckloads of grain.
So, something that really stood out to me about this portion of my discussion with Chuck was this idea of not demonizing conventional farmers. And we've touched on this at previous times in the seminar series that it shouldn't be an expectation, nor would it be realistic or feasible to expect all farmers to transition to organic. For some individuals, that is not the right choice. And even with the described benefits of organic, that might not be right for some people. There are, lots of things that come with the transition to organic agriculture. And for some operations, that might be right. And that is no need to demonize people or think that they are doing wrong on purpose. There are many more factors than just simply flipping a switch and moving into organic. And I think Chuck's discussion of, again, this mindset of wanting to influence change, but also not wanting to demonize conventional farmers is something that is really important in this work. And maintaining these relationships and having conversations with people about the effects of what they're doing is super important. But again, a focus on the relationships and maintaining those. And that is something, again, I think Chuck's background really speaks to in his position, and just maintaining those relationships is super important. And it also makes me think of some work, just thinking again about organic more broadly as a movement. The way to really inspire change is through those relationships, through peer-to-peer networks. And I think the Grain Place has done a good job with efforts like this one, this effort to spread information about organic to a broad audience and be able to translate some of the benefits is an important one. It's also reminiscent of some work I've stumbled upon. A guy named Damon Centola has done a lot of work on social networks and looking at what actually influences behavior change. And some of his findings are very interesting. I encourage you to look more into them if you are so inclined. But a few of his things that I think are relevant to talk about is this idea that he found through some of his work that the spread of information can be very easy. News and information can spread quickly, but spreading complex ideas like adopting a new behavior, especially thinking about organic systems or agricultural systems as a whole, when you are attempting to transition an entire operation, there are things such as immense costs or learning an entire new management style that must be incorporated with this transition. And so it's not as easy as just spreading the information like we have done throughout this seminar series. Just spreading the benefits is not enough to truly encourage farmers or practitioners to transition to organic. It goes far beyond that. And one of the most influential ways that happens is through personal relationships and peer-to-peer contacts. And like Chuck was saying, those relationships are really key to influencing behavior change. So maintaining those, not demonizing conventional farmers is crucial for organic as a whole to move forward. And with that, that concludes most of my interview with Chuck. I really enjoyed hearing about his work and his story and his perspective. But for now, we will move on to the next member of the Grain Place board I was able to interview, who was Dave Meyer. And so I want to give Dave a chance to introduce himself and talk about how he got involved with the Grain Place.
All right. Well, but I think it's important to set the stage that I did grow up in northeast Nebraska on a farm, and that farm was a farm that already had some depleted soils, low on water, kind of rough farming. So quickly appreciated the importance of soil health and water quantity. And that stayed with me throughout my career as a plant breeder, as I strove to breed plants that were drought resistant, insect resistant, things that were resilient underneath stresses. Then I started working internationally with things like the Gates Foundation and USAID, working on crops that were grown really with soils that were depleted and underneath adverse conditions, and saw a lot of different cropping systems. And then the last 4 years with the company, which was Corteva at the time, was in regenerative agriculture, trying to understand what regenerative agriculture was and how it was important to our company and the farmers we serve. And one overlying theme throughout all of that I just described was the importance of understanding that farming systems should be developed that work with nature and not against nature. And one example of somebody who was doing really good with that was Dave Vetter at the Grain Place farm. And so I was always very interested in the way he was thinking about things, the things he was approaching things, and the way he set up his complex rotation. So that's how I get involved with Dave Vetter on the Vetter Farm, is really understanding that mindset again of looking at agriculture holistically over years and seeing how systems work together.
So, from his introduction, you can see, similar to Chuck, the idea of mindfulness and a harmony with nature in farming was a big reason that Dave was drawn to the Grain Place and something that makes it so unique as a foundation, as a farm, as an organization. And so, with this same idea in mind, I asked Dave next about his thoughts on how to encourage this mindfulness throughout the entire ecosystem as of farmers and practitioners. And his response, it touched on many of the same themes presented earlier in the series. So I want to give Dave a chance to share his thoughts on that.
I think one of the biggest mindset changes that is in front of us as we think about agricultural systems going forward is to stop thinking about yield as a thing, as our measuring stick, as our metrics. It's much more than yield. It's always been about economic yield. And in addition to economic yield, we need to say it's economic yield over years and over seasons. And as we think about instead of yield, a better term would be what is the value? And so if you think about just economics, you have to, again, understand your equation of the cost of the crop versus what you got for that crop over seasons. And so if you can decrease your inputs, if you can decrease your money that you're spending on other things to grow the crop, basically your total net value goes up. So instead of just thinking about yield, it's how much money did you spend to obtain that yield? And also, as we know from the sciences, lots of different papers, lots of different studies, the last 10% of the yield takes an extraordinary amount of money to create that last 10%. So again, the target should be what is the value of that farm over seasons? And the value can be, of course, economics. What do you get for that crop and how much did it cost you to create that crop? But as you think about the value pie for that farm, really the amount you get for the crop and the amount you spent to get that crop is just one part of that value equation. Agricultural systems need to start to think about what are the other values you get from that cropping system. And other values could be what is healthy soil worth? How much does it save you on reduction in irrigation water if you're irrigating? How much does that save you on insecticides, pesticides? Those are all economic things, but you also have to think about the intangibles. Uh, how much can you think about what is high quality water worth? What is it that healthy soils can also reduce contaminants from the water before the water gets into either the rural well or the city well? What is that worth? What is the carbon sequestration worth, whether or not you get paid for it by the carbon markets? There are certainly carbon markets out there you can get paid for. Other markets that will probably be coming are nitrous oxide reduction markets, water quality markets. So pretty soon it becomes not how much did that field yield that season, it is what is your farm across all the different crops, whether it's primary crops, secondary crops, cover crops, grazing, what is that worth over seasons and over years? And so that is a fundamental change that needs to happen. And soon as producers make that mindset change, they look at their agricultural systems much differently than they would if they were only focused on how much yield can they get that particular season. It's not an or, it's an and, right? You
Mhm.
don't either have to focus on economics and yield or taking care of the environment. There are agriculture systems that allow you to do both. And that's the
Mhm.
really good news. There is an and instead of a or. And so regenerative systems, organic systems start to create systems that are both economically very viable and even better economics than other agricultural systems, plus as an added benefit to the health of the community, the health of the planet, you get these environmental benefits also. And it's understanding how you can devise systems to do both. And maybe along the lines, uh, you know, I talk about this a lot. I think about this a lot is you think about the interconnectivity of soil health through other health studies. Ratan Lau from Ohio State University has this thing that he calls One Health, and that is healthy soils cannot be separated from healthy plants, from healthy animals, from healthy ecosystem, from healthy food to healthy humans, and ultimately a healthy planet. And so once you understand these things are connected, you start to think about your agricultural systems differently.
So the last point here made by Dave was one of my favorite ideas to come out of this seminar series, and I think it encapsulates the sentiment behind the grain place, this whole series, and my personal journey as well. But I just really like this idea of the fact that there doesn't have to be a trade-off of this or that. There really is the potential for an and, this and that, not just looking at yields or protecting the environment, there really is an and to that. And additionally, his discussion of the One Health concept, I know that's something he is very interested in, and since I was introduced to it, I've become very interested in that as well. And we touched on that briefly earlier on in the seminar series, but I think thinking about the agroecosystem in this way, the One Health, the fact that you can't separate the health of the soil and the health of people and food and animals, it really exemplifies and encourages the mindfulness that both Chuck and Dave have been talking about in their responses, and something that makes the grain place unique, but should be more prevalent with decisions made by farmers around the planet. And again, the systems that they exist in don't always allow them to think in this mindful way. You know, there are many farmers who cannot change their operations because of the conditions in which they exist. However, I think it is important to try to encourage that in any way possible. And yeah, this was really one of my favorite things to come out of the seminar series. Moving on from that, my next question to Dave was about his view on technologies and improvements that are imminent in the world of agriculture and how these will play out for the future of organic and the agricultural industry as a whole.
I would say that the way different technologies are evolving and changing, that they will allow farmers to work with nature much easier than the tools they have now. And
Mhm.
so let me talk a little bit about that. So, what are some of the new technologies that will allow farmers to farm with what I would call in regenerative systems and organic systems, farming with nature? So one of the challenges with farming in a regenerative way, where you have your principles, and some of those principles are incorporating livestock into the agricultural system. They are a diversity of crops. They are including cover crops, keeping a living plant in the soil. These are complex things to manage on a farm, and it's
Mhm.
much easier just to go out there and farm the field in what we would call the conventional way with conventional tools. But
Mhm.
let's think about what technology is changing that will help farmers to implement soil health principles on their farm as well as organic principles. First of all, let's just start with the pivots. So for people who have pivots, instead of that whole circle needing to be one or two crops that you can only manage the water slightly with, we're getting to the point where the pivots, you can have any sort of field layout that you can imagine underneath that pivot, and it will water those fields accordingly. So each nozzle can be controlled. And so you can start to imagine instead of one or two fields being treated as fields underneath that pivot, you can have up to 15, 16 odd shaped fields underneath that pivot, each getting managed differently. So they can be different crops being watered differently. And as that pivot makes its circle, it adjusts the amount of water on those different fields. So that's something that couldn't be done before. So now all of a sudden, the pivot can be part of this very customized, complex irrigation robot going through the field. So that's the pivots. You start to think about how are we going to plant those fields, those small fields underneath the pivot. So let's imagine that we are going to 16 different fields underneath the pivot. Well, that's really hard to do when you have 24 row equipment and large tractors. But where equipment is starting to go is equipment is starting to become smaller, more nimble, more agile. And instead of one large tractor with 124 roll planter, you'll be having swarming autonomous tractors that are maybe, you name it, 3 to 4 rows, right? But they're all out there swarming together. They're small, they're agile. So now all of a sudden, it's really easy for you to plant and take care of those 16 odd shaped fields underneath your pivot. And so, why do you want 16 odd shaped fields underneath your pivot instead of one or two crops underneath there? You want to understand as you think about your soils, as you think about your climate, as you think about the drainage on those soils, what is the best crop suited for that particular part of your field? And let's make sure that's the crop we plant there. And maybe it's not even a crop, maybe it is a pasture, maybe it's uh, acres for wildlife, whatever it is. We want to get to the point where we use every acre of every land for its optimal use, and that's going to vary from area to area in that field. And so this smaller equipment will allow you to plan how you're going to plant, manage, and take care of those fields. The other thing that we're moving to as you think about how do you manage those fields, even if you're, well, you can say they're organic or regenerative instead of spraying the whole field with either an organically approved pesticides that they're coming out with or insecticide they're coming out with, or whether you're using electricity to shock them. You're no longer doing that to a whole field. You're using seek and act, which is basically understanding this is a crop, this is a crop, this is a weed. I'm going to do something to that weed, right? And if
Hmm.
it's organic, you need to use, of course, an organic approved method to take care of that weed. But the whole idea is you no longer are treating the whole field the same. You're treating the weed as something individual. So those are the types of technologies that are either here today or that are coming that's going to allow you to farm in a much more customized way to manage what your soils, what your climate is going to give you. And you can start to think about how do you create diversity with underneath the pivot, right? And how do
Hmm.
you think about integrating cover crops? How do you think about integrating interseeded crops? How do you think about doing that? It's going to be so much easier to do that with the equipment that's coming. And so it is really starting to think about then how do we mimic nature? How do we mimic the diversity of prairies? How do we mimic the diversity of different ecosystems uh, in an area? And how do we start to do that with agriculture? And technology is going to allow us to do that.
So, from this portion of my discussion with Dave, it was very interesting for me to hear what he sees in the future of technology in agriculture. And it really tackled a lot of questions that had been posed throughout this seminar series. Thinking about adding more complexity to a system can be a big deterrent. And if you look at operations like the grain place, where they have a complex 9 year rotation, it's very different from the two crop rotation that is commonplace throughout many systems, even organic systems. Um, so I think hearing that and hearing that technology is going to become more customizable and enable this complexity and become more precise and contribute to these beneficial environmental outcomes, that's a great thing to hear. As my personal field of agroforestry, this increased complexity is one of the biggest deterrents towards adoption. Agroforestry is the incorporation of perennials, trees or shrubs into agricultural landscapes. And when you add a new element to a system, especially a perennial element, a lot of practitioners don't have any idea of how to manage that. And it can be very difficult for adoption. It's hard to have someone sign on for something where they're not really sure how to take care of it, how to manage it. And so hearing that technology is really moving in this direction towards the complexity enabled systems, towards enabling farmers to do more things and smaller equipment and all of that, it's really promising. And also for my own personal work and research, I've heard lots of talking about using AI as well to assist in these transitions and assist in managing complexity with farmers. And so I think uh, it's a really promising answer, and I was glad to hear that. And I want to move on to the next question I asked Dave about, which was the overall expansion of organic and how to go about this process while guarding against the potential of more and more people who are just after the premium and checking the boxes. And so, yeah, I want to give Dave a chance to answer that question.
It's a really interesting um, mindset exercise, if you will, to say if there was no agricultural system in place anywhere, what would be the best agricultural system that you would create? And where would you do that at? So it goes back to if we want to continue to make the best use of land available for agriculture and optimize that land use so that there can be many areas left aside for non-farming uses for wildlife and enjoyment of people, you have to use the land efficiently. So instead of saying, I'm going to farm this, you should be saying, what is the best use of this land, right? Is this the type of soils? Is this the type of climate that should be really highly intensive farmed because it's resilient, it can stand that, you can do that in a way that doesn't harm that soil or doesn't harm the environment. That's the type of production system you should use. But then there are many other pieces of land that have the soils, have the climate that are conducive to organic. I don't believe that organic should be used everywhere, but organic should be used a whole lot more than they are today. Uh, your first choice should be organic. And then if for some reason organic doesn't make sense or doesn't work because your soils, your climate, or something like that, then you move into regenerative or the next step down, right? But the idea is, again, how do you create your agricultural system where you can optimize the farming system that that particular acre allows you to do, and balance that with the benefits of the environment. And how do you do that everywhere? So, um, organic as much as you can. And when I say organic, I immediately couple regenerative organic into that. I don't believe it helps the planet. I don't believe it helps community. I don't believe it helps the environment, to check the boxes for organic just to get the premium and not farm that in a regenerative way. That is just what I would think more of cheating the system.
Mhm.
So I believe that most people that are doing organic today are also inherently doing it regeneratively or as close to regenerative as they can,
Mhm.
because that's the mindset that they have. What we need to guard against is the people that are just checking the box for organic and really not thinking about soil health, not thinking about the environment, not thinking about community health, just thinking about that organic premium. That's what we have to guard against. I think the last thing is, and maybe it's just a little more philosophical, right? So, um, I think there needs to be a really good open discussion within communities with producers to think about, again, agricultural systems and not us versus them, right? It's not
Mhm.
organic versus conventional. It is communities trying to figure out how they can, thrive by making a living economically, but yet thrive by doing it in such a way where the environment is healthy, where the water's healthy, where the people are healthy, and how do you design all that together without starting to point fingers on the way which things have used to be done, right? It's always counterproductive to look backwards and say that was wrong. It's more productive to look forward and say, knowing what we do know now, how can we working together, not just the producers, but with the community working together, how can we create a more resilient agricultural system that helps the producers, that helps the communities in which they live? And how do we do that? By farming with nature as much as we can, with organic as a big part of that.
So from this answer, they've made some points that do circle back to my discussion with Chuck earlier about the idea of social networks and how relationships are really crucial to helping drive this organic movement forward. And I think that's something that really stood out to me about both these conversations with these guys who've been involved in agriculture and organic for a long time and have seen changes in the agricultural landscape. And so just hearing that even still relationship building and social networks are such a big part of what they want to focus on. Really drives home the importance of really how important these things are. So after having these great discussions, these interviews, I wanted to leave some space now to give a brief reflection of my experience doing this seminar series as a whole. And I wanted to thank again Dave and Chuck and Jared and everyone at the Grand Place Foundation who has supported me and made this experience possible. But I entered this seminar series as someone who had spent a little bit of time working on organic farms and had some general presumptions about the way that organic operations perform and their general benefits. But it really took diving into the literature and what's been published to really see what needs to improve, what the steps are forward for organic, and what the actual benefits are. So that said, I can pretty confidently say, as we've touched on many times throughout this program, uh, there are some pretty concrete environmental benefits, social benefits, and economic benefits that can be achieved from organic. And as we've again touched on several times, there is typically a diminished yield that comes out of organic operations. However, that's not the real value that organic provides, and that's not what it's intended to provide. Looking forward, I think, as we've discussed, there are some technological benefits that will continue to make organic and diverse and complex farming more feasible to individuals. But I think one thing that really stands out to me, especially from these final conversations, is the importance of peer-to-peer relationships and the ability to work with people who might come from a different background or might have different presumptions than you and have these important conversations about the effects of organic agriculture or agriculture as a whole. And I think there is a key part to play with policy, with governments, with NGOs that will drive this change in increasing organic adoption. But again, I think the grassroots relationships between one another in this social aspect is going to be a huge part. And understanding again, it's not an us versus them battle. It really is all of us working together. It's one health. It's impossible to separate any of these aspects, and it's impossible to separate each other. As I move forward from this experience, I do cherish the opportunity I've had here to hone my skills of looking at the literature and also really translating those results and trying to make them accessible to a broader audience. And I hope anyone who's tuned in to the series can take something away from this. I know I have. And yeah, with that, I want to conclude the series and thank you for anyone who's tuned in and anyone who's made it possible.